Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. The Australian economy is in a bit of trouble. Gross domestic product rose by just 0.1% in the March quarter. For the full year to the end of March, it came in at just 1.1%. Outside the pandemic, it's the worst 6 months of the local economy in decades. Gareth Aird is Commonwealth Bank's head of Australian economics. Gareth, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
G'day, it's nice to be back.
Economists were expecting a pretty miserable outcome yesterday, and miserable being 0.2% for the quarter. It was even worse than that. Why was the number so low yesterday, and what do you make of it?
Well, look, we thought it would come in at 0.1% on the quarter, so we actually picked that one correctly, albeit our forecast relative to the market wasn't too dissimilar. The reality is that the economy is basically ground to a halt. There's very little growth going on at the moment. The economy's felt the impact of significantly higher interest rates now for an extended period of time. That's weighing on household disposable income. The consumer's pretty soft. We've also seen residential construction fall again, which has some pretty negative implications for the housing market overall. And then also we had a drag on net exports. I mean, we can slice and dice the various components, but the bottom line is that we've got no real growth at the moment in the economy, and that means on a per-person basis, it's actually going backwards.
And that was 5 quarters of negative per capita GDP. Is that unusual?
Yeah, it is outside of a major negative economic shock, and that's not what we have at the moment. We're technically not in a recession, we're in a per capita recession. But normally you would get a policy response to a recession, which would be to stimulate the economy. In other words, if you got a monetary policy response, the central bank would be cutting rates to an economy that's barely growing. But they actually want the economy to be soft so that inflation comes down, and then they can eventually ease policy and see growth accelerate. So we're in an unusual period where policymakers actually want weak outcomes, ideally without seeing too much damage done to the labour market, to get inflation down, and then we can ultimately look forward to growing again and seeing an increase in living standards. But we're not there yet, and we're probably not going to be there for a couple more quarters.
I think Michelle Bullock yesterday, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, in Senate estimates characterised it as a narrow path. What chance of a recession, given all that?
Well, look, it depends how you define a recession. If we take the kind of standard definition used in Australia of 2 negative quarters of growth consecutively, that's a pretty low probability of getting that because we've got this tailwind of incredibly strong population growth, which basically inflates the aggregates. So I think in many respects, it's not really the right definition to use in Australia. It's more helpful to look at what's going on a per-person basis, and there you can clearly see we've been in a recession because consumers have been spending less and less in a volume sense per person for 5 quarters now. That, on our calculations, will continue again through the June quarter. Hopefully things pick up in the second half of this year, but it's probably going to require rates to come down. And for rates to come down, we need inflation to come down. So we're just in this period at the moment where they've gotten worse rather than better, and they won't get better until the Reserve Bank is comfortable that inflation is on its way back to the target band, and they're not quite there yet.
Is this just a normal economic cycle? Is this how economics works, and we're just at a particularly poor point of the economic cycle where we're feeling crunch, but we will come out of it? Or do you think this is different?
This is certainly different. And the reason it's different is because we had the big negative shock, which was COVID, and that was a recession by both technical standards, and unemployment went up. But the unusual thing during the pandemic was that government stimulated the economy so much by pushing money into the household sector, but households just couldn't spend it because they were told to stay at home. So we then came out of what was the negative shock, but because there was so much juice in the system and unemployment went so low, we then saw an explosion basically in demand, and then by extension inflation, and wages growth picked up too, which wasn't a bad thing. But then the economy effectively overheated, and so the RBA has been trying to slow it down, And so we've kind of gone into a manufactured slowdown, which policymakers want to be over as quickly as possible. But really, the way it ends is for inflation to be on a path that the RBA considers back to target. Normally, if we got growth figures like today against an uptrend in the unemployment rate, which is what's going on, interest rates would be cut. But because the starting point was such low unemployment and high inflation, the RBA is basically running restrictive policy to continue to slow things down to hopefully get to the point where we can get out of this. So the short answer to your question is this is a very unusual period.
Stay with me, Gareth. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Gareth Aird, Commonwealth Bank's Head of Australian Economics. Do you think the Reserve Bank and fiscal policy can land it such that it's a per capita recession, so we're in that already, but I suppose without worsening it too much, we can kind of get through the next quarter and perhaps the September quarter and come out the other side without too much damage to the economy?
Yeah, so look, I think you measure the damage at this stage through the labour market. It's absolutely true that households have been pulling back on spending, and that's unpleasant. And lots of people are cutting back on discretionary spending. They're eating out less. They're doing the things that they like to do less that cost money, but unemployment is still relatively low. So the way we get out of this, where we say we've had basically a soft landing, is for rates to start coming down, growth to pick up, and for the unemployment rate to have not risen by too much more from where we are now. Our base case at Commonwealth Bank is that we actually end up seeing that happen, but it is a tightrope. And the risk in all of this is that inflation gets a little bit stuck above target, and unfortunately the unemployment rate has to go up by more than is desired in order to get inflation back to target.
So what's the best case we can hope for here? Is it an unemployment rate of 4.5% and interest rates starting to fall later in the year? When I say best case, I'm talking very personal here. I'm not talking about bureaucrats or economists or anything like that, but person on the street. What is the best case?
Well, the best case, I think, from this point is that we see the next couple of inflation prints suggesting that inflation is actually going to get back to the target band in the not too distant future, and that unemployment won't have risen too much over that period of time, and then rates can start coming down. Because it's clear that things have got to soften a little bit further for inflation to come down. I take comfort, though, from the wages data, because we have seen wages growth moderate in a way which is basically consistent with the inflation target. The most recent quarterly wages print came in at 0.8% on the quarter. So you annualise that and you're a little bit over 3%. That's a totally fine number. What we need to see, though, is some of the stickier elements of inflation come down, just so that the central bank is then sure that we're going to land in time within the 2 to 3% band. They don't have to wait for us to get there before cutting rates, but they need to be confident that we're going to get there, and then they can ease policy, and that'll limit the lift in the unemployment rate. But, as the governor rightly says, it's a narrow path. It's arguably getting narrower the longer it goes on, but I think there's still a chance we can pull this off here if the next couple of inflation prints are somewhere around 0.8% on the quarter. That's our forecast, but there's obviously a lot of risk around that.
Now, national accounts are very backwards looking. The great thing about talking to someone from the Commonwealth Bank is you have a lot of real-time data. So I presume what you're talking about here, and the fact that this quarter will probably be weak as well, the June quarter, is also informed by real-time data, Gareth.
Yeah, that's right. So we've got more timely data on spending, and that's quite soft at the moment, and that's suggesting another weak GDP print. Now, what I would say is that the national accounts are backward looking to the extent they tell us what happened on the production front or the spending front, but economic growth leads employment growth, which then by extension leads the unemployment rate. So you can actually take signal from the national accounts as to what's likely to happen to employment growth from here, and that is that it will continue to slow, and then by extension, the unemployment rate will rise a little bit. So even though it's a coincident indicator, basically spending, and this is slightly backward looking, telling us what happened in the March quarter, it does give you a bit of a steer of where the labour market's heading. And the other thing I'd say too in the national accounts, which is a little bit forward looking today, it told us that the savings rate is very low. And we know that households build up some savings during the pandemic. And we could calculate basically how much there's got left outside of what's sitting in mortgage offset and redraw accounts. And it's not a lot now. So that's basically telling you that the tailwind that's been there, which has partly offset the impact of these really big increase in interest rates, that's kind of run its course. So again, I think that's telling you that the period of softness that we've had will continue a bit. Tax cuts will help at the margin that kick in on 1 July, but really I think we need some rate relief to get things moving directionally more the way we'd like to see them go.
And your base case for when we'll get lower rates?
Oh, look, our base case is we're looking for a November rate cut. That's arguably kind of best case at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to see the central bank cutting rates before then. We still need a few things to go right for them to cut rates by then, notably on the inflation front. But we're sticking with that at the moment because, as I said, the wages dynamics look favourable for getting inflation down. The labour market is loosening, which up until a point is desired. The growth picture looks pretty weak. We think if you package that up, all of that together, and then you just see that inflation data that gives you the green light to take rates away from restrictive territory, then we can see a rate cut by the end of this year. But I'd probably say at the moment that's kind of base case and best case.
Mm-hmm.
And, sort of worst case from here is that rates are stuck at the levels they are at the moment, and that, this period of weakness continues and the jobless rate rises, that bit higher than we'd like to see.
Gareth, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
It's nice to chat as always.
That was Gareth Aird, Commonwealth Bank's Head of Australian Economics. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.